Hi, we continue in Luke 23 today as Pilate has discovered that Jesus is from Galilee and turned him over to Herod. And so as we enter into this piece of our story, where you can look on the right side of the screen at the shape of Luke 22 to 23 that we've been going over throughout this entire section. Today we're on this section down here on the second half of this chiasm, 7 to 12, that we'll look at in just a minute. And as we've been noting in the last video, as we look at Jesus before Pilate, and really this longer section, all four Gospels, you can see by the part that's in bold, which is unique to each writer, how much of Luke is unique to Luke. So although we think of these three as the synoptic Gospels, there's really very little in common. Even Matthew has a whole series of things different than Mark here. For example, he has the story of Pilate's wife having the dream, etc. And only Luke has this scene with Herod that we have here. As you can see, it's all in black there. And John is, of course, very different. As we've seen, there are a couple of things in common that we'll look at more next time, including the fact that in Luke and John only, Pilate multiple times finds no cause to send Jesus to the cross, but we'll get there next time. So one of the things we need to look at is the relationship of Herod in Luke's gospel, because as I note, this scene is unique here. And you can see in the left side of the screen comparing them, or on the right side of the screen, the left column, comparing Mark and Luke here. One of the things that Luke has left out is this story that Matthew includes about the banquet with Herodias and the mockery of the elite there who are willing to, when they're drunk, to cut off the head of John the Baptist just for entertainment. Perhaps our story here is a substitute for that, because as we'll hear, Herod rejoices at hoping that Jesus will do some kind of sign. So the idea of the elite kings being basically frivolous in relation to the Jesus and John the Baptist movement might be common, but the stories are different. And you can also see, I won't go over all the details, some of the other elements that are left out. For example, Mark has this combination of beware of the yeast of the Pharisees and the yeast of Herod, but we don't hear anything about the yeast of Herod. Instead, we heard get away from here, for Herod wants to kill you, which we did not hear in Mark's gospel. And John doesn't have Herod mentioned at all, so it's completely outside of that. John instead has Caiaphas and Annas, the high priest, named, who are not named here. So to understand what's going on, Luke uses Herod generically, except in 3:1, and that's what you can see back here, where we hear, before I move on, Herod was ruler of Galilee, and his brother Philip, who's also known as Herod, and that's who's at issue here. Ruler of Iturea and Trachonitis. So let's look at this reign of Herod so we can get a sense. So Herod the Great is the one that's around in Jesus' birth from 70 to 4 BC. But then these offspring, and I won't go over all the elements of the offspring. You can see the chart down here. But Philip, as you can see, up to 34, up to around the death of Jesus, we don't know exactly when that was, of course, but somewhere in that ring, reigned over Iturea and Trachonitis. And we can see on the map Trachonitis way up here. Iturea, although it's not on this map, is in this range here. Caesarea Philippi was the city he had rebuilt and renamed for himself, as you can see there. But a long way from Jerusalem, way down here, that's at issue on. So not that important a character, really. And really, as we'll see in Acts, it's Herod Agrippa 1 or 2, as we'll have to explore later, that we see Paul facing in Acts. So Luke uses Herod as a generic, and as we saw in the uniquely Lucan story in Luke 19:11 and following, just on the eve of their entering in Jerusalem, where he tells the story about a person who's hated by his people but goes off to a distant country to gain power, and we noted how that was a thinly veiled analogy about Herod himself. Not this Herod, but Herod the Great, the one that was a friend of Augustus. And so we can see throughout that Luke is showing that the Herods are just functions of Roman power. They have no power on their own, and this Herod, as we can see, will be made to look ridiculous here, and is made to look ridiculous in Acts as well, as we'll see. So, as I was noting, our section here is the second part of the chiasm that we saw beginning and ending here. The verb for to accuse categorio is only these two places and one other time in Luke, framing the chiasm here. And this part was before Pilate, this part's before Herod. And as I was noting last time, at the end of our chiasm is the counterfactual and politically unlikely claim that Herod and Pilate became friends before this had been enemies. And it's one of the small themes that we're going to see here, but it's throughout Luke, of what people like Rene Girard have made a career on, the scapegoat theory. The idea that people who are of different views can find common ground by having a common enemy to blame things for. So in this case, the differences between Herod and Pilate over their relationship with Rome and Judea, etc., can be put aside for the common reality that Jesus is in the way of both of their pursuits of power. And so that'll be part of the frame here that we see. So let's leave that up, and we'll enter into our passage here, and then we'll we'll look at the question of rejoicing momentarily. So we began to see this, and we'll continue here. When Pilate learned, or literally recognized, and we see recognized in the Road to Emmaus story twice, which is going to be important there, and we've seen it a couple other times. But he's recognizing that Jesus, under Herod's jurisdiction, or literally authority, exousia here, there's no specific word for jurisdiction there. This is the last use of authority in Luke's gospel. He sent him off to Herod. And using a word that's only in this scene in all of Luke and only one time in Acts, so I highlighted it here. If you downloaded the earlier version of Luke 23 keywords, I've uploaded this one that includes this word 3 times here on a pempo. So you can see that 3 times, the sending back and forth, where Jesus just becomes like chattel between the Roman and Judean kings here, or representatives. Pilate's not the king, he's the governor. So he sent him off to Herod, and notice it's just Herod. It doesn't say Herod Philip or Herod Antipas, as my note below has only mentioned in this Passion account. Who was in Jerusalem at that time, because normally, like Pilate, he would have been in Caesarea. As we can see from Herod Agrippa in Acts 25:13, they'd arrived at Caesarea to welcome Festus, and that's where they hear Paul, not in Jerusalem. So that would be the normal place for the same reason that Pilate was there, because it's a seaside resort, and it's the Mediterranean breeze, and it's an international intellectual place of entertainment and discussion. And so they'd be much more comfortable there in Jerusalem, which would be a completely foreign place for him. But here he is with Pilate on the occasion. So when Herod saw Jesus, he rejoiced exceedingly. And I'd like to suggest this is making fun of him there, and we'll look at rejoicing in Luke in just a second. Well, as happens sometimes, I got through the video and didn't get back to explaining the rejoicing piece. So I'm just inserting this little piece in here, and we'll go back to the recording previously made. So as you can see on the right side of the screen, I've gathered all the occurrences of the Greek word ikare for rejoicing in Luke Acts to highlight how Luke is using it both for positive things and for the mockery, as we've been seeing of Herod here, to highlight what is worth rejoicing. And I won't go over this in great detail, but I do want to highlight some elements so we can see the pattern. So the purple ones here are rejoicing about heavenly things, if you will, and the red ones are rejoicing about imperial things. There's also the use here generically, and the New RSV translates this as greetings, because kyrie is used here often for simply the greeting word, as in Hebrew, shalom can be used as a greeting word, but also have a much deeper meaning. So those I put in gray because they don't really carry that other meaning here. But let's just look briefly at the elements of rejoicing here. So rejoicing at the birth, which will bring about the redemption of God's people. Mary to rejoice that the Lord is with you. And as you can see, underlining are the things to rejoice about here. Here, rejoice at those who are sided with Jesus, the poor, etc., for your reward is great in heaven. Do not rejoice that the spirits submit to you, but rejoice that your names are written in heaven. Notice the connection between those two. The entire crowd in chapter 13 rejoicing at the wonderful things Jesus was doing. In the story about the lost sheep, when the person finds it, they lay it on their shoulders and rejoices, and so do all their friends. And similarly with the parable of the prodigal son, that the family has to celebrate and rejoice. So we see when lost things are found, or when things are done that have rewards in God's view as opposed to imperial view. Zacchaeus hurries down and rejoices to welcome Jesus. And as we see, the disciples begin to praise God joyfully as they come down from the Mount of Olives and enter into Jerusalem. But negatively, we saw that the chief priests rejoiced greatly and agreed to give Judas money to betray Jesus. And we see Herod here rejoicing because he wanted to see Jesus perform a magic trick of some kind. In Acts, we see it continue as the council, after some of the apostles leave the Jerusalem Sanhedrin, they rejoice that they're considered worthy to suffer dishonor for the sake of the name. Again, echoing what we see back up here, your names are written in heaven and that your reward is great. When they came out of the water here just to baptize the Ethiopian eunuch, he went on his way rejoicing, having been baptized. When Barnabas came to check out what was going on and saw the grace of God, he rejoiced. And when the Gentiles heard that they were included, they rejoiced and praised the word of God. And then we see those examples. And finally, when the members read the letter from Jerusalem, they rejoiced at the exhortation. So all those examples of positive joy in contrast with the imperial sources of joy we see here. relationship with the movement back to 3:19 and 20, and the note that he beheaded John the Baptist without naming why he'd done that in Luke's gospel. So he rejoiced greatly, for he'd been wanting to see him, recalling 9:9. Let's go back to that to make these connections. Herod said, John I beheaded, but who is this about whom I hear such things? And he tried to see him. So there we hear back in 9:9 both that Herod had heard things about Jesus and tried to see him, and both of those come back here, wanting to see him for a long time. Hikanon, chronon, not kairos here, just for a long period of time. Echoing the hikanos we saw earlier about the question of the swords, was that enough? Because he'd heard about him, again echoing 9:9, and was hoping, and this is certainly a mockery of the sense of hope that we see earlier in John's Gospel, certainly, or in Luke's Gospel rather, certainly for examples like in 6:34, what hope is there to receive, what credit there is in that one, if you just engage in the reciprocity code. Hope is supposed to be about something that only can be satisfied in God. But here Herod is hoping for the most menial, trivial thing, to see Jesus act like a circus performer, to make some kind of sign. Perform is over-translating to make it sound like circus here, but literally from the root word ginomai, to make happen, to make some kind of sign. And again, if we're listening carefully in Luke's Gospel, we can hear the judgment on that already back to Jesus in 11:29. When the crowds were increasing, he began to say, this generation is an evil generation. It asks for a sign, but no sign will be given to it except the sign of Jonah, which of course we looked at there. So Herod, in seeking a sign, not to discern whether God is present in Jesus, but just for his own entertainment, as if Jesus was some kind of magician here, can certainly be seen as harshly criticized for that. So we don't actually hear from Herod. It's interesting that Luke puts us in indirect speech. We heard Pilate speak, and we'll hear Pilate speak. We can see it right down below in the scene we'll look at next video there. But Herod is left in indirect speech from the narrator. So he questioned him at some length, literally in many words, and Jesus gave him no answer. And it's echoing what we've already seen when Jesus told them that if he questioned them, they would not answer. And he's certainly not going to waste his time with Herod, who obviously has no interest in really discerning what's God's role in all this, but simply to be entertained. Notice that Herod doesn't seem concerned about the political consequences either. He doesn't seem the slightest bit concerned that Jesus is disturbing the peace or is claimed to be a king who would be in rivalry with him. He's basically not taking this seriously at all, and that makes sense given that Jesus is under arrest and seems to be completely powerless here. But is God powerless? We'll have to find out. So Jesus gives no answer. As Green notes below, for Greco-Roman readers, Jesus' behavior may have been seen as an expression of admirable self-control, perhaps even nobility. For readers of the Septuagint, his silence is reminiscent of the servant of Yahweh, with whom he is thus identified, as we've already seen in Isaiah 53:7. And I note that Brittany Wilson has challenged this view that Green is expressing there, and many male scholars do, of seeing Jesus' behavior here as noble and fitting within a manly perspective. And certainly giving no answer here can show self-control. But it's also dishonoring to be challenged and not to respond. And so as Wilson has shown, really Luke's portrayal is that Jesus doesn't fit the manly stereotype of a stoic or a philosophical man. And certainly crucifixion will be the extreme of that, as we'll see momentarily. And so now, although Jesus is in Herod's hand, apparently the chief priests have come along. And we last saw the chief priests and the scribes at 22:2, but just earlier we saw the chief priests and the crowds around Pilate, and we last saw the chief priests at the arrest with the soldiers. So the chief priests keep changing their dance partners, so to speak, and the scribes appear here seemingly out of nowhere. Again, you can see the note below. We saw them in the beginning of 22 and the end of 66, but they play no part here, and then they're silent as well, and just being heard in terms of the narrator. We don't hear what accusations they make, in contrast to what we saw before Pilate, where we heard the very specific accusations. The word for vehemently here, eutonos, is only here and one other time in Acts, where it also expresses a similar thing. And accusing, as I was noting, is framing the chiasm here with 23:2, as we can see. So with all these accusations, Herod seems to have no concern at all. And now he, having failed in getting Jesus to respond to his questioning or getting him to do some kind of sign, he joins in the crowd and treats him with contempt and mocks him. But I'd like to suggest that while in the story, Herod and his soldiers are treating Jesus with contempt and mocking him, Luke is treating Herod and his soldiers with contempt and mocking them in the story here, and readers have to decide which mocking they side with. So Herod and his soldiers here, and what happened to the chief priests and scribes, we don't know. They're not mentioned again here. Treating him with contempt, with exuthenontas here, only in Luke amongst the Gospels. Let's look at it back in 18:9 where we saw it before, and the little parable Jesus told about contrasting those who thought they were righteous in their own eyes and regarded others with contempt, and that's the Pharisee there. So that contempt of looking down on others is what we see Herod and his soldiers doing here, seeing Jesus as simply below them, not worthy of their serious attention. And again, echoing the mocking that we saw in 2263, and Paisos here again, without having to name the specific mocking, but basically suggesting that the whole Jesus story is just ridiculous. And most of Luke's audience would assume that. Frankly, most of my audience throughout the decades of viewing this work finds it ridiculous in our secular capitalist culture, where believing in the Creator God's power over the power of weapons and money seems absurd and is easily mocked. And yet we have to decide whether that mocking expresses truth or the insecurity of others who might recognize quietly or even unconsciously that their own system is the one that's fragile and will come down, and it's God's system is the only one that will last over time. But again, that's the eternal question that all readers and hearers have to grapple with if they choose. So they mock him in contempt, and they put on an elegant robe on him. And notice it's a bright garment, estheta lampron here, like Solomon in 1227 in all his glory, and like the rich man. So this is expressing the Roman sense of elegance here. Notice it's not royal. It's not like, as you can see in my note below, in Matthew where he's given a scarlet robe, or in Mark a purple cloak, or in John a purple robe, all expressing some sense of mocking his royalty here. Here it's mocking whether he's a member of simply of the wealthy elite, like the rich man with Lazarus, although Solomon was described in all his glory, although it's not given the specific clothing. But we do note that the risen Jesus we'll see in the guy at the tomb, the angels at the tomb are in dazzling clothes there, so it can go either way. The bright garment can represent God's presence, and something like we see at the Transfiguration, or mocking the elite here, but not the royal robe in purple and red. So if you see artistic images, they don't represent Luke if Jesus is dressed in red or purple in this scene. And so Herod, done with this and having failed to get what he wanted in the entertainment, sends him back to Pilate. And our narrator concludes with this amazing element here. That same day, Herod and Pilate became friends, philoi. And this is the only use in Luke of friends in the political sense. We see it in John's Gospel where the chief priests say to Pilate when they're pushed against the wall, if you release this man, you're no friend of Caesar. And in that sense, friend doesn't mean someone you just hang around with and have a beer with. It means someone whose side you're on in when the political alliances are counted up. And so Herod and Pilate would not have been friends. We could translate that simply allies here with each other here, alalos, contrasting their unity with their difference. And before this, they'd been enemies. Is it an expression of loving enemies? Well, being friends isn't loving, but it's certainly showing that there's a commonality in opposing Jesus. And that's what, again, René Girard and others following that have really shown, that the death of Jesus is a scapegoat function, except unlike other scapegoats, the story shows that Jesus is innocent. So when you put all your sins or all your worries or all your anxieties on an outside group, whether that's immigrants or communists or whoever it might be in a given cultural context, there has to be some element in which it's believable that those people are actually doing what you're afraid they're doing. Which is why in the cultural context I'm in, where there's a lot of anti-immigrant feeling around, the idea that immigrants actually are good for the economy is something that people can't hear and will refuse to hear, as if immigrants are taking the jobs that ordinary people want, picking fruit and building houses and all those kinds of things. So the truth is the enemy of the scapegoat principle, and that's what Luke will show, that Jesus is actually not someone that Herod and Pilate should be afraid of if they were oriented toward the longer-term reality of things, and not just with the imperial status quo. So after that, Pilate will have another round and try to resolve what he's going to do with Jesus, and we'll continue with that next time. See you then. Bye-bye.